I want to tell you something. Tell you that I'm very happy you're on the show and that I'm a big fan of yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jack.
When Clint Walker graced the screen as the rugged cowboy in Cheyenne, he captured the hearts of millions. But beyond his on-screen persona, there were stories about him that seemed almost too incredible to believe. From daring adventures to heartwarming encounters, fans often dismissed these tales as mere legends. But then everything changed when some shocking evidence came to light. So what was discovered that made even the biggest skeptics rethink their views? Join us as we explore the astonishing stories of Clint Walker that turned disbelief into awe. The Western that changed television forever. Before Gunsmoke or Bonanza captured the hearts of audiences, it was Cheyenne that set the benchmark for television Western heroes. When Cheyenne first galloped onto TV screens in 1955, it brought with it an expansive portrayal of the West, one that felt broader, more open, and more authentic than anything audiences had seen before. At a time when most television Westerns played out as half-hour morality tales, confined to tight studio sets and tidy conclusions, Cheyenne arrived with the scope of a feature film. It didn't rush. It didn't shrink the frontier to fit a schedule. Each episode invited viewers to ride alongside Clint Walker, who portrayed Cheyenne Body as a solitary drifter whose sense of justice shaped the story just as powerfully as any gunfight. Produced by Warner Brothers Television for ABC, Cheyenne was never typical Western fare. It was a gamble. Television's first hour-long Western, built with cinematic ambition and a confidence that television rarely allowed itself at the time. Walker's Cheyenne wasn't a man hunting conflict. He was a man who couldn't walk past injustice once it crossed his path. Across 7 seasons and more than 100 episodes, Cheyenne helped define the golden age of the TV Western, turning Clint Walker into a household name known and trusted by millions. Long before ideas like shared universes or crossover storytelling became fashionable, Cheyenne Bodie served as a quiet anchor, linking a wider frontier that stretched across multiple Warner Brothers programs without ever calling attention to itself. When Cheyenne debuted on September 20th, 1955, it made television history. Not only was it the first hour-long Western, it became one of the earliest hour-long dramas to prove it could survive and thrive beyond a single season. ABC's decision to back a slower, more film-minded series paid off immediately. Viewers didn't drift away. They leaned in. From its wide-open visuals to its deliberate storytelling, Cheyenne didn't just alter television's landscape, it reshaped expectations. And nearly 70 years later, its influence still lingers. The gamble that paid off. Cheyenne didn't even begin as a standalone success. At first, it existed as part of Warner Brothers' Presents, a rotating anthology that treated television like a weekly movie house. One week brought The Frontier with Cheyenne. The next offered a small screen take on Casablanca. Then the slot shifted again to King's Row. 3 entirely different worlds, sharing one time slot, each taking turns under the same banner. It was an experiment that could have failed. Viewers weren't asked to commit to one hero or one story. They were expected to adapt week by week. Yet something unexpected happened. While Casablanca and King's Row struggled to hold viewers, Cheyenne settled in. Audiences didn't just tune in, they stayed. When the other 2 titles were canceled, there was no spectacle and no announcement. Cheyenne simply kept riding. What began as one piece of a rotating lineup suddenly carried the full hour on its own. That shift mattered more than it appeared. It proved audiences weren't merely tolerating longer Westerns. They wanted them. In total, Cheyenne ran for 8 seasons, and 108-hour-long episodes. At a time when most Westerns wrapped everything up neatly in 30 minutes, this series allowed stories to breathe. Conflicts unfolded instead of being rushed. Characters returned. Viewers learned that depth didn't require sacrificing momentum. Cheyenne's survival wasn't luck. It was evidence. Evidence that television Westerns didn't have to be disposable to succeed. Evidence that audiences would follow a quieter hero over longer roads. And evidence that once viewers are trusted with something richer, they rarely want to go back. What that success ultimately revealed wasn't just a winning format, but a singular presence strong enough to carry it alone. The gunslinger who changed the TV Western forever. When Clint Walker stepped into Cheyenne as Cheyenne Body, a former Army scout turned wandering cowboy, there was an immediate difference in the way this man moved through the West. Body wasn't chasing anything, and he wasn't running from his past. He drifted after the Civil War because drifting felt honest, because the open road gave him space, and because trouble had a habit of finding him whether he stayed still or not. What separated Bodie from the long line of television gunslingers in the 1950s wasn't strength. Plenty of Western heroes were strong. It was restraint. Cheyenne Bodie could win a fight, but he rarely wanted one. Where others reached for their guns, he paused. Where threats were shouted, he spoke calmly. His voice stayed level. His posture stayed steady. His presence did the work before a single word landed. That calm carried weight. In saloons ready to erupt and towns balanced on the edge of violence, Bodie didn't arrive looking for blood. He arrived looking for balance. He listened before judging. He weighed situations instead of reacting to them. And when he finally stepped in, it felt earned, never automatic. The gun was there, but it was never the point. This quiet fairness became the backbone of the character. Cheyenne Bodie wasn't driven by revenge or haunted by rage. He followed an internal line he refused to cross, even when the world around him ignored such limits. In a television landscape crowded with fast triggers and loud heroes, restraint became authority. That moral steadiness gave Cheyenne its weight. Week after week, Bodie functioned as more than a wandering cowboy. He became a compass, reminding audiences that strength didn't need to shout, and justice didn't need to sprint. Sometimes it could simply walk in, stand tall, and refuse to be pushed. And that was the power of Clint Walker's Cheyenne. He didn't dominate the screen through force. He held it through presence. The Gentle Giant. Clint Walker's size became part of the legend almost instantly. At 6'6", with broad shoulders and a frame that filled the screen before he ever spoke, he looked like the kind of man television westerns were built around. His sheer physical presence helped him land the lead role in Cheyenne at a time when casting directors were searching for someone who could embody the scale and danger of the frontier. Yet Walker never played Cheyenne Bodie like a blunt instrument. That was the surprise. In a genre crowded with wiry gunmen and sharp-edged bravado, he moved differently. He stood still when others paced. He listened when others barked. His strength was obvious, but it was never waved around for attention. On screen, Bodie felt solid, almost immovable, as if the West itself had taken human form. Beneath that weight, however, was gentleness. He was the kind of man who could end a fight without enjoying it, restore order without claiming credit, and step aside once the moment passed. That balance, physical authority paired with quiet restraint, became the show's emotional anchor. Viewers didn't trust Cheyenne Bodie simply because he looked unstoppable. They trusted him because he didn't rush to prove it. And in that restraint, Clint Walker quietly reshaped what a television Western hero could be. Not louder, not faster, just steadier. There was no mystery about why casting directors noticed Walker the moment he walked into a room. His imposing build made him impossible to ignore. But Cheyenne didn't endure because he looked the part. It endured because Walker refused to play the role the obvious way. In a genre filled with lean, hard-edged gunfighters who moved fast and spoke louder, Walker slowed everything down. He didn't compete with the noise. He anchored it. His presence felt almost geological, as if the land itself had decided to stand upright and listen. What held viewers wasn't just strength, it was contrast. This was a man who could clear a saloon if pushed, yet never seemed eager to prove it. His voice stayed calm. His movements stayed economical. Even in moments of tension, restraint guided him. That balance changed how audiences read the character. Cheyenne Bodie wasn't feared because he was dangerous. He was trusted because he was fair. He carried authority without cruelty and power without swagger. The same hands that could end a fight could just as easily help someone back onto their feet. That combination of brawn and compassion didn't come from the script alone. It came from Walker himself. His physical size could have turned Cheyenne into a caricature. Instead, it became a counterweight to his humility. That's how Clint Walker earned the reputation that followed him for decades. Not as the loudest cowboy on television, not as the fastest draw, but as the gentle giant who proved that the most commanding presence on screen is often the one that never raises its voice. That same restraint didn't end with the character. It shaped the rhythm of the show itself, right down to the way Cheyenne announced its presence before a single line was spoken. The theme song that walked beside him. Once Cheyenne stepped out of the Warner Brothers presence rotation, the change was immediate and deliberate. The series no longer borrowed attention. It had earned its own identity. That identity opened with a theme song called Body, written by William Lava and Stan Jones, the same songwriter behind Ghost Riders in the Sky. The music didn't rush. It moved with purpose, a steady rhythm, broad, confident horns. It matched Clint Walker perfectly, mirroring the way Cheyenne Bodie crossed a town or entered a frame. No hurry, no excess, just forward motion. The song didn't announce a hero. It walked beside him. Behind the scenes, though, the calm didn't last. Walker eventually collided with Warner Brothers Television over salary and creative control, and the dispute was serious enough to halt production entirely. For more than a year, Cheyenne vanished from the schedule, leaving a noticeable gap where one of television's most dependable westerns had been. A BC filled the slot with Bronco, starring Ty Hardin. The frontier remained, but the rhythm shifted. Cheyenne Bodie was missing. When the dispute was resolved, Walker returned. There was no reinvention, no apology tour. Cheyenne simply resumed, and when it did, it carried itself with even more certainty than before. The interruption hadn't weakened the show. It clarified its value. The return confirmed what audiences already knew and networks were still learning. Cheyenne wasn't interchangeable. The show didn't work because it filled an hour. It worked because of the man at its center. The music, the silence, the standoff, the return. All of it followed the same principle that defined Clint Walker's Cheyenne from the beginning. Strength didn't need to announce itself. It only needed to hold its ground. A backstory that changed the Western. From its earliest episodes, Cheyenne planted something deeper beneath the dust and gunfire. Cheyenne Bodie wasn't simply a drifter with a steady hand. His past carried weight. According to the show's early canon, Bodie lost his parents as a child and was taken in by a Cheyenne tribe raised within a world most television westerns of the 1950s barely acknowledged as human. That choice mattered. At a time when Native Americans were often reduced to faceless threats or nameless obstacles, Cheyenne moved differently, quietly, without speeches or self-congratulation. Body's upbringing gave him an understanding that ran both ways. He understood settlers pushing west, hungry for land and survival. He also understood tribes fighting to preserve a way of life already slipping away. That dual awareness shaped every decision he made. He didn't rush to take sides. He listened. He weighed history against circumstance. When conflict came, his choices weren't driven by blind loyalty or reflexive violence, but by balance forged long before the series began. The show never stopped to explain this. It trusted the audience to notice. Body's empathy wasn't framed as weakness. It was treated as experience. For viewers, that backstory reframed the Western hero. Cheyenne Bodie wasn't standing between two worlds by accident. He had lived both. And that history gave the series a moral gravity rare for its time. One that unfolded through choice rather than declaration. Once again, Cheyenne trusted stillness over spectacle. It didn't shout its progressiveness. It let it walk alongside the story, steady and unassuming, just like the man at its center. It became a ratings powerhouse. By the 1957 to 1958 season, Cheyenne was no longer just a successful Western. It was a measurable force. Ranked number 13 in the Nielsen ratings, the series outperformed a wide field of primetime comedies and dramas, many of which were considered safer bets in an era when Westerns were still treated as niche entertainment. The ranking told a deeper story than numbers alone. Audiences weren't tuning in out of habit. They were choosing Cheyenne. Week after week, viewers followed its slower pace, its moral weight, and its quietly authoritative lead. In a competitive television landscape, that kind of loyalty didn't happen by accident. For ABC, the message was clear. This wasn't a trend to test cautiously. It was a direction worth committing to. The network doubled down on Westerns, leaning heavily into the formula that Cheyenne had proven could work on an hour-long canvas. Within the Warner Brothers television stable, new series followed. Maverick arrived with a lighter touch and sharper wit. Lawman brought a sterner, more procedural edge. Each show carried its own personality, but all of them traced their confidence back to the same source. Cheyenne had already done the hard part. It proved that audiences would stay with a Western that took its time, that a hero didn't need to dominate every scene to hold attention, and that a quiet moral center could compete and win against louder, flashier programming. The ratings didn't just validate the show, they reshaped network strategy. And without ever raising its voice, Cheyenne helped turn the television Western from a gamble into a foundation. Episodes were edited into feature films overseas. It didn't take long for Warner Brothers Television to notice something unusual about Cheyenne. The series didn't just look good for television, it looked theatrical. The landscapes were expansive, the pacing was deliberate, and at the center of it all stood Clint Walker, framed less like a weekly TV lead and more like a classic film star. So the studio made a move few had seriously attempted before. Select two-part Cheyenne episodes were carefully edited together, retitled and repackaged as feature-length films for international release. These weren't afterthoughts or bargain exports. They were presented as full Western features, designed for audiences overseas who had little or no exposure to American television. The strategy worked effectively. In several countries, moviegoers didn't discover Cheyenne Bodie in a living room. They met him in a theater, on a large screen. Larger than life, but still restrained. Still calm, still moving at his own pace. For those audiences, Cheyenne wasn't a TV experiment or a serialized character. He was a cinematic Western hero, introduced the same way John Wayne or Gary Cooper might have been, through wide shots, measured storytelling, and a commanding physical presence that didn't need exaggeration. In some regions, years passed before Cheyenne ever aired locally as a television series. By then, Walker's cowboy was already familiar, already trusted, already established as a figure of authority and balance. It was another first for the show. Not loudly advertised, not treated as a novelty. Just a practical decision that revealed how far Cheyenne had stretched beyond its original format. Television hadn't borrowed from cinema in this case. Cinema had quietly borrowed from television and made it work. Unlike ensemble westerns such as Gunsmoke or Bonanza, Cheyenne made a deliberate choice to stand alone. There was no familiar town waiting at the end of each episode. No steady circle of side characters anchoring the story. Everything revolved around one man, and that was by design. Clint Walker carried the series almost entirely on his own. Cheyenne Bodie drifted from settlement to settlement, never lingering long enough to build roots. Each town brought new faces, new tensions, and new moral knots to untangle. Once the problem was faced and order restored, Bodie moved on. The people he helped stayed behind. He didn't. That structure changed how the show felt. Episodes didn't play like chapters in an ongoing domestic drama. They unfolded like self-contained Western films. A beginning shaped by circumstance. A middle weighed down by choice. An ending defined not by comfort, but by departure. Every week offered a fresh test of character, not continuity. The absence of a fixed setting placed all the weight on Bodie himself. His values became the through line. His restraint became the rhythm. Without a supporting cast to soften the edges, the audience learned to read him closely. His pauses, his silences, and the way he assessed a room before taking a step forward. That roaming format wasn't just a stylistic decision. It reinforced who Cheyenne Bodie was. A man shaped by motion. A figure who didn't settle because settling wasn't the point. The road was where his sense of justice stayed sharp, and each new town became a mirror reflecting a different version of the same question. What do you do when you can help? And what do you do when helping means leaving again? That repetition, episode after episode, gave Cheyenne its unique weight. Not louder than its peers, just lonelier. And in that loneliness, unmistakably, its own. That sense of movement didn't stop with the character. It extended outward, into the world he traveled, into the spaces around him, the land beneath his boots, and the horizons that kept pulling him forward. California locations doubled for the Old West. On paper, Cheyenne was filmed on a studio backlot. In practice, it rarely felt confined by one, while the production made use of the Warner Brothers. Studio's backlot, the series consistently pushed beyond it, leaning into California's rugged terrain to sell the scale of the frontier. That choice mattered. The camera didn't stay boxed in by false horizons. It opened up. Locations like Iverson Ranch and Vasquez Rocks became recurring landscapes in Cheyenne Bodie's travels, not as scenery for spectacle, but as working terrain. Jagged rock faces, dusty passes, hills burned pale by the sun, places that felt weathered rather than staged. Those locations carried history. Hollywood had used them for decades, but Cheyenne treated them with patience. Wide shots lingered. Riders moved slowly through the frame. The land wasn't just something to cross. It was something to reckon with. That approach gave the series a visual weight most television westerns of the 1950s simply didn't have the time or budget to attempt. For viewers watching from city apartments or quiet suburban living rooms, those landscapes did more than decorate the story. They expanded it. The West didn't feel symbolic or distant. It felt reachable. Vast, yes, but tangible. A place with room for solitude, for danger, and for the kind of moral testing Cheyenne Bodie carried with him from town to town. By letting the land speak for itself, Cheyenne blurred the line between television and cinema once again. The frontier wasn't suggested, it was shown. And in those wide, sun-baked stretches of California earth, the series found a scale that made its lone rider feel exactly where he belonged. Small against the land, steady within it. Cheyenne Bodie rode beyond his own series. When Cheyenne finally ended, Clint Walker didn't disappear from the trail. Cheyenne Bodie didn't either. Instead of a clean farewell, the character drifted across the wider Warner Brothers frontier, crossing paths, sometimes briefly, with heroes from Sugarfoot, Bronco, and Maverick. It wasn't marketed as a grand idea at the time, but in hindsight, it was one of television's earliest shared universes. Familiar faces passed through each other's worlds without explanation or fanfare. Cheyenne Bodie simply existed beyond his own series, moving through the same West as everyone else, guided by the same quiet code. Even decades later, the connection never loosened. At Western festivals, Walker was still introduced as Cheyenne Bodie, not as a former role, but as a lasting identity. The name carried weight. It always had. Behind the scenes, Warner Brothers understood his appeal. The series often leaned into Walker's rugged frame with bare-chested scenes that reminded audiences just how physically imposing he was. But the show didn't survive on looks alone. It was well-written, well-acted, and popular enough to run for 7 strong seasons without losing its footing. Walker brought more than physical presence. His calm baritone singing voice appeared occasionally on the series, subtle but effective, enough for Warner Brothers to produce an album of him performing traditional songs and ballads. It was another extension of the Cheyenne image, unforced, unflashy, and rooted in tradition. Early on, the studio announced plans to cast Walker in a feature film titled The Story of Sam Houston. The project never materialized, but it signaled how seriously they were considering him beyond television. Walker himself was less restless. In April 1956, he openly admitted he didn't crave variety for its own sake. Westerns kept him outdoors, active, grounded. That was enough. Still, the studio pressed forward. Warner Brothers cast him in Fort Dobbs, directed by Gordon Douglas. Critics took notice of his physical authority. One famously described him as the biggest, finest-looking Western hero ever to sit a horse, shoulders rivaling King Kong's. Box office returns were modest, but the experiment continued. Next came Yellowstone Kelly, again directed by Douglas, and co-starring Ed Burns from 77 Sunset Strip. The film found mild success, enough to justify one more attempt. That led to Gold of the Seven Saints, this time paired with Roger Moore, another Warner Brothers contract player. By then, the pattern was clear. Walker translated well to film, but it was television that had shaped him, and where his legacy remained most firmly planted. Along the way, Cheyenne episodes were edited into feature films for theatrical release overseas. A brief clip of Walker galloping as Bodie appeared in Maverick. He even turned up as a guest on 77 Sunset Strip. The character kept circulating, never confined to one box. Clint Walker didn't cling to Cheyenne Bodie. He simply never disowned him, and audiences never asked him to. Some roles fade when the final credits roll. This one kept riding, quietly, steadily, and without needing a sunset to make it feel complete. That quiet forward motion, the refusal to dramatize endings or dwell on triumph, extended beyond the screen. It shaped the way Walker moved through his own life, even when the road ahead suddenly disappeared beneath him. Clint Walker's near-death experience. In May of 1971, Clint Walker came closer to the end than anyone realized at the time. While skiing at Mammoth Mountain, a routine run turned dangerous. The terrain was uneven, the path unforgiving. Walker lost control. What followed wasn't dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was sudden, violent, final enough that by the time he reached the hospital, 2 doctors believed he was gone. He wasn't. During the brief window when he was clinically dead, Walker later described an experience that stayed with him for the rest of his life. He spoke of heightened awareness, of clarity, of feeling more alive rather than less. Pain was absent. Fear never arrived. Returning, he admitted, didn't feel urgent. It wasn't framed as revelation or spectacle, just observation. Quiet and matter-of-fact, the way he spoke about most things. The moment turned on chance. A 3rd doctor, passing by, stopped to take another look. That decision changed everything. Walker was revived and rushed into surgery, and doctors worked to repair the damage to his heart. Against expectation, he survived. Against precedent, he recovered quickly. Within 2 months, he was back to work, moving forward without ceremony, as if brushing past death was something to acknowledge, but not dwell on. The incident didn't soften him or harden him. It clarified him. Those who knew Walker afterward often noted the same steady temperament, the same grounded presence. If the experience altered his perspective, he carried it privately. There were no grand declarations, no reinvention, just a man who had crossed a line and returned without fanfare. Nearly 5 decades later, on May 21, 2018, Clint Walker died quietly of heart failure in Grass Valley, just short of his 91st birthday. He left behind his daughter, his 3rd wife, his half-sister, and his grandson. His twin sister, Lucille Westbrook, had passed years earlier. For someone so often associated with endurance and physical strength, it was fitting that his most remarkable moment had nothing to do with size or power. It was about stillness, about a pause between breaths, and about returning, not to applause, not to myth, but to the same steady path he had always walked. Like Cheyenne Bodie, Clint Walker didn't chase endings. He moved through them calmly. And when the moment came to stop for good, his legacy was already standing, quiet, solid, and unmistakably his. Were you a fan of Clint Walker's role as Cheyenne Bodie in the television series Cheyenne? And what other Clint Walker series have you seen that is also your favorite? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You'll enjoy it.